Let's get started since we are already Let's get started since we are already 5 minutes in. No worries. So this session is export-led and manufacturing-fed growth. I'm Ruchir Agarwal. I'm visiting Harvard and Yale this year. I'm on sabbatical from the IMF. This session, I wanted to give you a 30-second overview on what we'll be talking about and then introduce the speakers. We know that, as we heard this morning, that there are large changes happening in the manufacturing landscape globally, and much of those changes are happening with what's happening in China, with rising unit labor costs, with geopolitical tensions. And in this context, there are companies thinking about relocating their manufacturing bases, their supply chains. And what we've seen over the past few years is our countries in Southeast Asia especially have gotten a large share of that pie, whereas India so far has not able to attract as much of that supply chain reallocation happening globally. This is not only important for India, but it's also important for the world, since 1 in 6 people in the world are living in India today. And their integration into the global supply chain means lower cost of living for everyone around the world. So this has huge welfare implications. And one may say that the absence of India in the global supply chain and the manufacturing share of production is possibly the world's largest missing trade. And what can India do about that? We already started talking about that this morning. But to shed more light on that, we have a wonderful session, perfect for after lunch because you're going to wake up. And so on my right, we have Professor Devashish Mitra. He's a professor, a renowned academic at Syracuse University. He is an expert on trade, political economy, and development, so perfect for this session. One thing that I wanted to highlight about him is he's one of these, his influence is so wide because he's been he's been on the editorial board of several journals shaping how the world thinks about economics. He's been on the editorial board of Journal of International Economics, Journal of Development Economics, European Economic Review, and so on. So very much looking forward to hearing from him. And then the discussant today is on my left, Mary Lovely, Dr. Mary Lovely, who is currently a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute of International Economics. She is also a professor emeritus at Syracuse University as well, so we have a Syracuse team here. What's really interesting, there's so many interesting things about Mary, but 2 things to note. One is that, don't be scared. One is, last year she was the Carnegie Chair on U.S.-China relations at the Library of Congress. So she's taught a lot about this changing landscape that I've previewed. And second, on any given day, if you turn on your TV, you might find her on Bloomberg, BBC, or various channels. So we're very much looking forward to hearing her. So I've been instructed, my only role really is to be timekeeper. So you have 40 minutes, and then you have 20 minutes, and the audience has 25 minutes or so. Okay? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard, for that introduction, very kind introduction. As you can see, it's a long title, and Professor Arvind Panagaria and I came up together with this title after discussing for a while. Let's see how it works. All right, so this is manufacturing-fed, export-led growth for gainful employment and skill creation. I want to start with, which sector should we expect to deliver growth and good quality jobs in India? So if you look at, basically, we're looking at manufacturing, agriculture, and services. If you look at the agricultural sector in India, the average income there is basically, 33% of India's per capita income, roughly. So agriculture is certainly, agriculture can't be an engine of growth or creator of good jobs because the productivity there is low, income levels are low. So if you move people away from other sectors into agriculture, you're not going to get growth. Now, let's look at services. If you look at, the OECD statistics, education at a glance, you'll see that, if you look at the working age population, close to 80% have education levels below upper secondary, roughly 12% have tertiary education, right? So 12.9%, roughly 13%. So it's clear that the education levels are not high enough for a large number of people to qualify for good service sector jobs, such as jobs in IT, IT-enabled services, finance, and other business services. There's some scope in tourism and transportation with those education levels, but you cannot, it would be impossible for India to rely on tourism and transportation to grow for the next 10 to 20 years at 8% plus, at a growth rate of over 8%. So the scope mainly is in in manufacturing to make a significant dent in the jobs problem, right? It's not services, not agriculture. It has to be manufacturing. But then the next question arises: what kind of manufacturing? So if you look at firms by their size, you see that small firms that that have employment of less than 20 workers, 75% of manufacturing workers are in those kinds of firms, and they only account for 10% of the manufacturing output. Clearly, this shows a huge productivity gap between large and small firms. If you look at the formal sector, formal manufacturing sector versus the informal sector, in the formal sector, the average wage is 6 times the average wage in the informal sector. Now, India's labor-intensive manufacturing is actually concentrated in firms with less than 20 workers each, while China's in 1,000-plus worker firms. So, and we know that productivity levels are much higher in China. So, based on all this, we can really conclude that good jobs will have to be created in relatively large formal sector manufacturing firms and labor-intensive industries. And in these labor-intensive industries, output growth and job creation will go together. So, but there are challenges. The first thing is what I just mentioned, that India's manufacturing employment is concentrated in small firms, in sharp contrast to China. So how are you going to compete with China or other countries like Vietnam, where there are a lot of large firms and you have a lot of workers in those large firms? The second thing is, of course, that India's share of informal sector in non-agricultural employment is very high. These are old statistics, but I'll come to the new ones soon. But the latest ILO report on that was in 2012, and India's share of informal sector in non-agricultural employment was 84%. The predicted share based on per capita income is 60%. If you compare it with China, not because China is at the same income level. China's per capita income is 2.5 times that of India's, but we like to do India-China comparisons. So it's 33% in China. And Brazil, Costa Rica, and Uruguay, which have higher per capita income levels with the same level of poverty, in 2012 they had the same level of poverty as India, was 40%. Uganda, a poorer country in terms of per capita income and higher rates of poverty, had 69% in the informal sector. So now there's been some recent improvement. There's a there's work by Goldar, a very recent work, where he's saying that the estimated share of informal employment in manufacturing in India is now 70%. He says it's likely to improve with the, the new labor codes and so on. But, there's work by, Poonam Gupta, who's somewhere here, with Rana Hassan and another co-author, Kumar. They find that, if you look at different states in India, you will find that there's faster employment growth in labor-intensive sectors in states with flexible labor markets than in others. So it's clearly showing us that labor regulations are a hindrance to, in making firms larger, going out of the informal sector to the formal sector. I'll come to that in a minute. But these are certain challenges that that India faces in promoting labor-intensive manufacturing. But if you want to grow your labor-intensive manufacturing, you basically have to rely on exports, because that's when specialization comes in, and you specialize according to your factor-based comparative advantage, and the labor-intensive manufacturing sector could be much larger than it can be in a relatively closed economy, right? So not that India, we can call India a closed economy, but I'm just trying to explain why exports are important. They help your comparative advantage sector grow. So coming to exports, India should be able to export a product when its wage advantage there is greater than its productivity advantage in that product relative to the rest of the world, or the wage disadvantage is less than the productivity advantage. In other words, India should have a comparative advantage in these labor-intensive manufacturers to be able to export those goods. So, and there are several reasons why exports will spur growth. Exploitation of scale economies. If you have one large sector in which you specialize, you might have scale economies there. You're competing with the best in the world on export markets. There's technology diffusion. There's learning by exporting. You're interacting with strong rivals. You're learning from them. You're learning from producing for consumers in developed countries. And there's also this growth-enhancing structural change, because for you to be an exporter of, labor-intensive manufacturers, you have to produce it in larger firms. And by definition, those larger firms will then have to be in the formal sector. So there's going to be decline in informality, and so you're moving from low informal wages to higher formal wages. But there's also expansion of manufacturing relative to agriculture. And then you have larger firms, small firms will, disappear because of competition when you open up to trade. But, larger firms will not only survive competition, they'll also gain market share elsewhere. So, so all these things will lead to growth through exports. And then if it's labor-intensive manufacturing exports, then you'll have the creation of good jobs as well. And there'll be exploitation of scale economies as a result. Wages should go up. So this is basically, at the theory level, why we expect exports to generate growth. Empirical evidence, there are, and I won't go into the details of that because I have a limited amount of time. But there are a couple of claims that have been made. And Danny Roderick has been involved in both these claims, that there's, and with him is Hajun Chang, who's also made a similar claim that the import substituting phase for the developing world, which is 1960 to 73, relative to, the outward orientation phase, 73 to 84, relative to that, the import substituting phase did better, but Arvind, in his work, has kind of provided a multidimensional rebuttal, right? And shown that, if you look at the period of openness, that's when 95 to 2013, that's when countries accounting for 73.4% of developing country population experienced over 3% per capita income growth. That was in spite of the fact that the world economic climate was much worse, and the developed world was growing much slower than in the previous phase. The 42 countries that Danny Roderick talked about, they only accounted for about 18% of the developing country population in those times. And he also has shown that, if you look at the countries that were growing at a per capita income growth rate of greater than 3%, they had high exports to GDP ratio, or the GDP exports to GDP ratio was growing very fast. And then, none of the debacle economies, as he calls, negative 3% to 0% growth, saw any kind of import surges, as people would like to claim. There's also this thing about, growth was brought about by investment coordination through subsidization of investment. That argument also is rebutted by Arvind Panagaria in his 2008 work, where he shows that labor-intensive export growth in Korea preceded growth in machinery exports, and that's when growth also started overall. Higher economic growth also started in South Korea. So there's also better cross-country work now that was, about 24 years ago, Frankel and Romer. There's always this there's a positive correlation between exports to GDP ratio and GDP, but there's a problem of two-way causation. But Frankel and Romer solved that, and basically they find that the positive responsiveness to income to trade openness becomes even greater when you correct for that. So if trade increases income, then obviously during transition growth should go up, right? So if you look at India here, you find that around the mid-80s, around 86, that's when exports to GDP ratio kind of picks up, right? And there is around 2000, 2001, there is a further acceleration that lasts up to 2008. And those are, easily the higher growth periods in India. And, this, if you look at the period of openness in trade and investment, that's 2003 to 12. You find that the growth rate has been about 8.3%. Now, there has been some increase in protection more recently, but even if you look at 2010 to 2021, the openness is way more than what India experienced pre-1991. So we have even in the last decade, there have been 4 out of 12 years of 8% growth, and 8 out of 12 years of 6% growth. So, and then there is also micro-evidence. Praveen and I had a paper that showed that trade liberalization was followed by an increase in growth rate of firm productivity in India, and then more recent work by Topalova and Khandelwal also confirm an increase in firm level productivity due to trade liberalization. So since I don't have a lot of time here, let me try to say that India's recent export performance hasn't been great. In fact, if you look at India's comparative advantage, India is actually should be in labor-intensive products, low-skilled, labor-intensive products. Because India is a low-skilled, labor-abundant country. India has 17% share in world population, 3% in world GDP, 3% share in world GDP, and average education levels are very low. But yet you see doubling of tariffs in entry-level products like beauty aids, watches, toys, furniture, footwear, kites, candles, electronics, and then you had further tariff increases in 2020 and 2021 on electronics and auto components and so on. The average tariff rate has gone up in non-agricultural products from 10% in 2015 to 15% in 2021. Calculations by Arvind Panagariya also tell us the same thing. The different summary stats here. But one thing he finds is that about 12% of the tariff lines had rates above 15% in 2010. They've gone up to, by 2020-21, went up to 25%. So these tariff hikes actually show that India lacks competitiveness even in these entry-level labor-intensive products. India should have been the exporter of some of these products. In fact, now it's kind of trying to protect itself from foreign competition in those products. So clearly, there's a failure to grasp its comparative advantage. It really hurts India's input processing and assembly, and those are low-skilled, skilled labor-intensive tasks. For China, that was the engine of growth, provided good jobs, so clearly, let me repeat, India has failed to grasp its natural factor abundance-based comparative advantage. It has been outperformed by Bangladesh and Vietnam in labor-intensive textile and apparel exports, and this work with Asha Sundaram here and Rana Hassan that I've done, we find that within industries, India actually specializes in the relatively capital-intensive products and also uses more capital-intensive techniques. And in fact, it uses more capital-intensive techniques compared to China in paper and printing, leather, rubber and plastics, chemicals, etc. Shouldn't be the case. So, of course, we keep talking about restrictive labor laws can explain high capital intensity, but there's also concentration of employment in small-scale enterprises. So it could be history-driven. Maybe there's a persistence of small size, even though a small-scale reservation is long gone, but there's possibility of multiple equilibria due to external economies. Maybe India is stuck in a bad equilibrium. There's and we know that labor regulations can be avoided by remaining small. And there are land acquisition restrictions, right, in the form of, in many forms. Let me not go into the details. There's low maximum floor space index. There's also, it's very difficult if you want to be a large firm. The land acquisition laws are such that it would be very difficult to acquire contiguous pieces of land from different owners to operate firms at large scales. Problems related to infrastructure and credit market imperfections. We heard in the first session there's been quite a lot of improvement in financial infrastructure and overall infrastructure, digital infrastructure as well. So India is moving in the right direction there. Now, so the question is, given all this, can the export-oriented manufacturing model actually work for India? But if you give up on manufacturing and exports of manufacturers, that's going to be equivalent to giving up on growth and creation of good jobs. We don't want to do that. But recent developments are encouraging. There's been progress on labor reforms. India has negotiated some new FTAs. Arvind has floated the idea of setting up autonomous economic zones. It's pretty feasible. And then, there's the new geopolitics and rising wages in China, also kind of along with, these long duration COVID lockdowns in China, provide have provided India an opportunity. The question is whether India can grab this opportunity or not. As I mentioned, I'm not going to go into the details. There's been quite a bit of progress on labor reforms, apart from raising the IDA threshold from 1,100 to 300 workers, can be raised further to maybe 1,000 or 1,000 plus. This has also, by a few states, but then it's now gone into the IRC, the Industrial Relations Code as well. Union membership, any 7 workers earlier could form a union. That's now, IRC has raised it to 51%. There's a unified web portal to report compliance and labor regulations. You cannot be harassed by labor inspectors so easily now because there are automatic algorithmic triggers for inconsistencies, following which inspections will be held. Then there's, these labor codes that we have, they eliminate duplication and inconsistency, so they reduce the regulatory burden. And then, of course, fixed-term labor contracts have been introduced, so that provides a lot of flexibility to firms. New FTAs, UAE, Australia, you might say Australia is a small country, its population is 26 million, but its per capita income in PPP terms is 7 times India's at exchange rate, it's 28 times. It's not so small in terms of market size, but then it also will be competing with Vietnam and China because they also have FTAs with Australia, but these countries also have higher education levels, better infrastructure, they have more flexible labor markets. So it puts pressure on Indian policymakers to carry out domestic reforms. And again, if India can has to reduce tariffs on cotton and aluminum, it's going to help India with its final products, export of cotton garments or anything also that requires aluminum as an input. So India is in talks with the UK, EU, Canada, Israel for similar FTAs, and hopefully that continues. Setting up of AEZs, we talked about that, autonomous economic zones. In India, there are 250 special economic zones, average size of 0.3 square kilometers. China's Shenzhen is 1,950 square kilometers. They say Gujarat's Mundra is very big, the SEZ, but it's under 400 square kilometers. So there's a need for AEZs, 500 square kilometer plus, 5 or 6 of them, in areas which are already inhabited, so you could have relaxed labor regulations with relaxed FSIs, a floor space index. These AZs will be a coordinating device for agglomeration. And there are many, I don't want to go into the microeconomic forces of agglomeration, but in many ways they could increase productivity. Public-private partnerships there will ease capital constraints. And, if you have construction activity starting there, immediately you're going to get employment growth. Now, India in global supply chains, there's the tariff on inputs makes it hard for India, right? There's high tariff on inputs, but there's also finally good tariffs that have made sectors like the automobile sector very inefficient. Now, India has this new opportunity in global value chains because of the new geopolitics, rising Chinese wages, and so on that I've already spoken about. So where are the skills going to come from? The exports are going to certainly, create some incentives to for people to acquire more education, especially vocational training and so on. Also for firms to invest in the training of their workers. This we've actually seen in some of our own work on Vietnam. After Vietnam had the bilateral trade agreement with the US. Their exports expanded both in quantity and quality, and that's helped with, the skill formation of workers. So there is no reason why this won't help India as well. So how much? 15, 1.5. So so if you look at Vietnam, their exports have gone up in quantity and quality. Their children now have a lower likelihood of dropping out of education from secondary school. Young men and women have a higher probability of finishing college or vocational education after high school. And there are higher education levels after the BTA with the US. And wages of high and medium skilled workers there have, relative to low skilled workers, have gone up. So clearly, the skills supply is responding to incentives. So, that's one way of developing your skills, through exports, right? Because you have people in the informal sector, you have people in agriculture whose wages are pretty low. So exports creates this, the possibility of much higher wages in formal labor-intensive manufacturing sector. So, and people do respond to incentives. They don't, go and do PhDs, but they basically, try to get some vocational training. Now, this is the most important part, and I want to emphasize that there's been some rise in protection recently. But I want to emphasize that mercantilism doesn't work. It is not feasible. It's impossible, right? So you cannot have export promotion and import substitution simultaneously. This is a corollary of the Lerner symmetry theorem, which basically is the equivalence between X% tax on exports and X% import tariffs. So, it's mathematical. You can raise the value of a fraction by increasing the numerator or decreasing the denominator. You cannot fight against that, mathematical reality, right? So, and therefore, you cannot have both export promotion and import substitution at the same time. Imports are the reason why we export. What are you going to do with the foreign exchange that you earn through exports? Import barriers will reduce demand for foreign exchange. That'll lead to an appreciation of your currency, and in turn will make exports more expensive your exports more expensive abroad, and the volume of exports will go down. So, and another way of thinking about it is that import substitution moves resources into production of import competing products. So less resources are left for production of exportables. Also, there's a substitution effect when importable products become more expensive relative to your exportables. So domestic consumption switches towards exportable. What are you going to export? You're consuming them yourselves. So now, does the nature of the production today make it harder for export to be an engine of growth? Has India missed the bus on this strategy? People talk about automation a lot, but if you look at how, the extent of automation in labor-intensive production, it's not a lot. There are a lot of things, especially assembly of cell phones. A lot of attempts have been made to automate that, and a lot of active labor-intensive production activities within that process of production of cell phones, and they haven't been successful. Same applies to shoes to a large extent. While automation has made considerable progress, it has far from replaced all labor-intensive production. The current method of production fragmentation and offshoring is actually very useful for developing country like India, because it creates opportunities in many more labor-intensive tasks, even within production of products that are overall capital-intensive. Plus, it provides the technology, advanced country technology to work with, so it has to make labor more productive. So can create better jobs as a result. When we talk of global value chains, you need to use imported inputs. And there's work by Veeramani and Dheer where they show that if you use imported inputs, rather than, you also try to produce all your inputs domestically, you're going to get higher overall gross exports, higher domestic value added, and employment. In other words, per unit, the value added might be lower, but you're doing so much more of it, there's so much more volume that you get more domestic value added. It's very simple. There's tariff inversion in India, meaning that input tariffs exceed output tariffs. That actually puts Indian firms at a disadvantage, and India, it makes it harder for India to jump onto these global value chains, right? In what the economic survey is calling network products, like electrical machinery, electronic equipment, road vehicles, office machinery, and so on. So that creates problems with export growth. Now, if you look at the recent budgets, 1920, 2021, and 21-22, they all raised tariffs on many parts and components and made this tariff inversion worse. The last two budgets actually have fixed that to a certain extent, reducing tariff inversion. But then the 2022-23 budget got rid of exemptions on capital good imports and raised it from 0 to 7.5%, which is not good, right? So it does create problems. So let me end with my main messages very quickly, and I'll take just 2 minutes. So I'm advocating for emphasis on labor-intensive manufacturing. To increase the scale of that, you need export expansion of those labor-intensive manufacturers. For both, for scale economies, also for expansion of the sector in general so that it can provide more jobs, good jobs. And further labor reforms are needed. We need to India needs to build on recent progress. IDA threshold, 300 is nothing. You want to compete with China, go 1,000 plus. Need more FTAs, and India is in talks with many other countries because the multilateral system is not, the WTO system is not working very well. So it's totally paralyzed right now. You want to work around these labor laws, land acquisition laws, set up a few AEZs. Take learner symmetry very, very seriously, right? Mercantilist goals are just impossible to achieve. You're fighting, basic mathematics to actually, work against the learner symmetry theorem. GVCs, not IVCs, meaning India needs, global value chains, not indigenous value chains. So PMP, like which is the phased manufacturing program, does not make sense at all, right? So jump on to GVCs, take advantage of these new opportunities created by the new geopolitics and rising wages in China. Lower tariffs in general, right? But get rid of tariff inversion altogether. Build on recent progress of the last two budgets, except that they raised tariffs on capital imports. I'll end there.
Okay, my customary thanks to the organizers who are here. And to say what a pleasure it is to discuss this paper. India's ability to generate manufacturing-fed, export-led growth is, of course, highly important for India. We were reminded that 1 in 6 people on Earth live in India, and raising India per capita income is important then for global development. But no one thinks it's going to be easy. India has been at this for a long time. We've discussed it at many of these conferences. But India is making progress. I remember being here where I was told quite sincerely and seriously that India would just skip manufacturing and industrialization and would just move directly just to service-led growth. And Professor Panagria, among others, were quite skeptical, to say the least. And now we see that we're back and saying no, that the skill level of the people and the need for development now requires us to begin this phased manufacturing-fed, export-led growth strategy. So Devashish's paper is very rich. It has lots and lots of ideas, so I won't be able to do it justice. It's compelling and timely, obviously, given some of the things I'm going to talk about and he talked about. It's basically impossible to see a future in which India both fails to raise its manufacturing share of GDP and is able to grow robustly. This is India's moment, I think, and I'll try to explain why I think it's its moment for manufacturing liftoff. India has made some preparations for this moment. Reforms have been made that make India a more attractive place for manufacturing, but there is still substantial stasis not staying in place, and even some backsliding. So we still see this as a very policy relevant and active area. So one of the things that Devashish tries to do in the paper is ask what can be done to seize this moment more fully. So he makes 4 broad arguments, which I will review very quickly. One is that he argues that the manufacturing share must grow. Agricultural productivity is below average, and that some of those workers must move into the secondary or tertiary sector. It's interesting to note that moving workers out of the agricultural sector often has the effect of raising agricultural productivity as well, because we have too many people on too little land. He notes that most Indian workers have upper secondary education or below, so that high-paying service sector jobs are out of reach. So it's really not the tertiary sector I'm talking about, but the secondary sector. Manufacturing sector is now 18% of GDP, but informal employment sector, a lot of it is informal employment, and they have a very low there's low productivity, and that rising wages will require expansion of the formal manufacturing sector. The second argument is that exporting spurs manufacturing, that if we want to have a robust development of the manufacturing sector, we also need to make room for expansion of exports. So the question is why and how? Why? He believes because India has a comparative advantage in labor-intensive activities. To take full advantage of the enormous potential scale, some of that will have to be exported. In other words, you'll have to rely on external demand to absorb some of this exploitation of the natural comparative advantage. Exporting obviously transfers labor from ag to manufacturing, from a low-wage, low-productivity sector to a higher-wage sector. And as I said, also has the potential of raising wages in the or at least incomes in the agricultural sector as well, both of which will be reflected in higher GDP per capita. Exports spur Indian manufacturers to raise their productivity through a variety of channels, which Devashish detailed in his presentation. Importantly, export competition leads to exit of small firms. This is a very, exit and entry is a very small part of the process that we observe as countries go through structural transformation. And that's a process by which productivity grows, but as I'll mention in a minute, it's also a process that can be very difficult for the political economy. Lastly, he makes the note that empirical evidence supports all of these links. The third argument he makes is that India has failed to grasp the golden ring or brass ring. The main evidence he presents is that India's exports to GDP ratio stalled post-2010 after rising steadily after 1990. He suggests that the pattern of new duties, which India has imposed, suggests that India itself believes it cannot compete in low-skilled, labor-intensive products and must protect itself. He argues that manufacturing is held back by multiple causes. Tariffs have risen on inputs, tariff rebates are insufficient even when we have processing trade, and they don't apply to domestic sales, because oftentimes the answer to we need to cut tariffs is, oh, but they don't matter, because in processing you can have a rebate. He argues that labor regulations still constrain despite reforms, and they need to continue reforms. Land acquisition is still difficult, infrastructure is insufficient, and credit markets are imperfect. So there's a whole menu of policy areas that might be attacked. The last argument is that India could do better, if only we had some more progress on labor law reform. We've had signing of an FTA with Australia and UAE. We could have more. Too little? He argues, yes, we need to do more FTAs. Brings up the idea of autonomous economic zones. Suggests we could experiment within these zones with fewer restrictions on labor. We could force agglomeration. And of course, make sure that processing trade rebates get paid. It's interesting to note that one of the complaints that Apple had in its experience with India, which we can say is now coming to a much happier outcome with more and more Apple-based activity in India, early reports were that it didn't have local suppliers and that it couldn't guarantee contracts to firms that didn't exist, but it would want to give those contracts. This strikes me as a classic coordination failure problem, where the government could have played a useful role within, perhaps, an AEZ, or autonomous economic zone context. So here's my guy. Haven't we been here before? Is this really the same old story? Is this what we were talking about 15 years ago at SEPA? I would argue, no. This is India's moment. External factors favor India as a location for manufacturing now. Changes in relative cost of manufacturing, both organically and through policy changes, have occurred, mainly from higher costs in China. So over the since 2010, really, China's costs have been going up. Its productivity growth has been maintained, such that its global share of exports, manufacturing exports, actually rose through part of that period since 2010. But that productivity, they can't squeak more and more out of each unit of labor, and we're already seeing China shedding activities, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Obviously, not everything is organic. There are policy changes, U.S. policy changes, and Chinese policy changes, such as Devashish mentioned in particular, the lockdowns, have really pushed MNCs, C-suites, to pull the China Plus One strategies off of the shelf where they've always been and try to actually execute them. This is an opportunity for India. Lastly, the U.S. government really wants India in its secure supply chains. And it may be ready to pave the way for Indian exports by further burdening Chinese suppliers, I'm sad to say. But that is definitely a possibility. Another way, a more positive way, we saw with Secretary Yellen's recent visit to India, which is U.S. government loan to Solar First, set up operations in in India, to try to kickstart the solar industry within China, export-based solar industry. So this is India's moment. This is important that get this right now. The agreement, another area of agreement I have with Devashish is that exports enhance growth. Devashish cites a great deal of the relevant literature. You know, the choice is not between export-led growth versus investment-led growth. It's exports and investment. If you look at the tigers, if you look at China, it wasn't just exports, it was exports and investment. Exports require imports. This is another point that Devashish makes quite clearly, and it's more important than ever given GVCs. And we know so much more now about developing country entry into GVCs thanks to the World Development Report a couple years ago, which really focused on the characteristics of countries and which sectors they were able to penetrate in terms of global value chains, and then what those outcomes were for social outcomes, et cetera. I also agree that India has progressed too slowly. And what I did here is took some numbers from something that I've been working on at the Peterson Institute, which is we've looked at global export shares in manufacturing. And you will see in the very first column here the 2019 share for 4 exporters: China, India, Mexico, and Vietnam. And then the change in that share between 2010 and 2019. And what you can see on that very first row there is that China has actually increased its global share of manufacturing over that period. It's gained 1.7 percentage points. So when we look at India, India's gained 0.2, less than Mexico, 0.7, and surprisingly, a lot less than a much, much smaller competitor, Vietnam, 1.4. Then we take that bundle and we divide it into 4 different sub-bundles by so-called degree of manufacturing. The first bundle is what's called labor-intensive and resource-intensive manufacturing. And here you would have your apparel, textile, furniture, another important. And you can see here China's large share, almost 30% of global manufacturing exports in this category come from China. But they've lost share over time. I don't know if this will work. So they lost 1.8%. And if you look at who's gaining, India, 0.2. This should be the sweet spot for India, according to Devashish. And it's underperforming, I would argue. Who is it underperforming? Well, it did the same as Mexico, and we know Mexico has been underperforming for a long time, unfortunately. Vietnam, 3.0. What about low-skill and tech-intensive manufacturers? Here again, India lags Mexico and Vietnam. China gaining, still. Medium skill and tech-intensive. Here you see a particular standout is Mexico at 1.6. Why that? Autos are in this category. And as we all know, under the USMCA, before that NAFTA, North America favors auto production into Mexico. Lastly, high skill and tech-intensive manufacturers. Don't be fooled. This includes a lot of labor-intensive activities because what's in here? Electronics machinery, cell phones, your TV sets, so communications devices. And what do we see? China still has 20% of the market. It increased its market share between 2010 and 2019. India only gained 0.5% in its share. Only went up by it only has 1.6% of global exports, but that's a huge bundle, right? This is all, and yet it was able to increase only a little bit. Mexico was not able to increase its global share at all. Its share to the U.S. went up, but it lost in other places. Vietnam, again. And note that the endpoint we use here is 2019. So this is before, really, COVID, and before the Trump tariffs really start to bite. And after the Trump tariffs, of course, you see a lot new investment into Vietnam, much of it from China itself. So you see why, and we know, Samsung moved all their phones to Vietnam. Nike produces most of its shoes in Vietnam. So these are the kinds of things that India should be getting, but isn't. So that is why I say I agree with Devashish, that India has progressed too slowly. So just a few comments, a few ideas to throw out, things that I think, Devashish wrote this paper that's so broad and inclusive, but he couldn't think of everything. So what are some of the things that stick out to me? FDI is critically important. Don't neglect its role in GVC participation. India has worked very hard on reforming its FDI regime, but FDI goes to a country for a lot of reasons. I put here a table I've used before where we look at the FIE share of exports. FIE is foreign invested enterprises. And if we just look at the first column of numbers, it's the share of FIE exports of all exports. And you see in capital intensive, it's 37.9% are coming from foreign invested enterprises. High tech, almost 50%. We know that. Labor intensive, 63%. Why do you need foreign investors to create things like even handicrafts? That was a question that was asked in 1995, but they came in through the SEZs and they broke the barriers. Fast forward 2005. What you see is that those shares in some cases, well, in all cases, increased. So the share of foreign invested enterprise FIE exports of all exports in all 3 of these different goods categories increased. So that tells you something about how China did it, how the secret of their export surge is foreign direct investment, and of course with the technology transfer that also occurred in that. That is changing now. The value added in China's exports has increased steadily, as we have found from the OECD and other studies that use value added as opposed to gross exports. And we're seeing that very much in specific case studies, like Apple supply chains, where China's value added continues to rise. Some sources even predict that as Apple moves assembly operations to India, Chinese value added will continue to rise. It also means that China-India trade will continue to rise. Something important when we talked earlier about bifurcation of global supply chains. It ain't happening. Comment number 2 is that exporting means clusters. Clusters lead to agglomeration, efficiencies, economies. If we look at the regional shares of China's exports, we see that in general, the concentration of exports increased over the reform period. The Northeast, which had been favored heavy industry, really lost export share from 40% of all exports to 15% by 2016. Now that has very important social dimensions, clustering. So one, you have to create these clusters. AEZs are a way to do that. They're a form of workaround around domestic regulations that you think are holding you back. China used them to contain foreign influence on a very small area. They then spread the advantages that were given within the SEZs throughout the country. Done well, they can promote the development of productive clusters and then can lead to wider spread of those productivity gains. However, to raise the domestic value added in exports, local firms must be able to replace imported intermediates over time. But this happens organically. It's not the result of like a PMP program. Lastly, they're not a substitute for governance. We can look and criticize SEZs in a number of ways, including failure of environmental compliance, not just in China, also in the maquiladora case. Tax advantages are given to foreign companies that aren't given to local companies. That's a revenue loss for the host government. So there's a lot of governance issues that AEZs don't magically make disappear. The last comment I have is, where are the women? There are no women in this story, but women are an essential part of manufacturing takeoff. Women form a large share of the manufacturing employment in the maquiladora, in China, in Vietnam. You see women going to work on their little sea clothes. And so where are the women? How is this going to happen? Think about it. You've got clustering on highly connected locations, those where India can ship at a reasonable cost. Minimizing transportation costs is important. How are you going to get women there? That's a problem. Women first have to be in the labor force, and secondly, they have to be able to migrate from rural to urban areas, maybe even cross-state. India female labor force participation is shockingly low. On a global scale, it is shockingly low. I really couldn't believe it when I started looking at this. How are you going to have manufacturing takeoff with a quarter of women in the labor force? That's a question I'm just going to throw out there. I don't know the answer. Indian women are unlikely to migrate for employment opportunities. Marriage is the most important driver of migration in India, especially for female migrants who move between villages. Now, that's very different than the Chinese experience, and I know India and China are not the same societies, but this is something that has to be dealt with. How do you make it possible for women to be more economically active and included? So this is a real inclusion issue. Comment, maybe this is number 4. Transformation, structural transformation is wrenching. And this is in a democratic setting. The accommodating the dislocation that structural transformation is going to bring has to be built in the system as the system is built. If we think we have a magic moment and we're going to build a system, we need to build it in. Within agriculture, structural transformation promotes the outmigration of the young and the hardy. And there's a loss of village vibrancy, and there can be a loss of family cohesiveness. And as Scott Rozelle has documented, it can lead to deleterious effects on the children who are left behind, and then you're kind of eating your seed corn for the next generation. Within manufacturing, social transformation means the closures of small firms, some of them family firms, the churning of workers across firms and activities. How do you accommodate that type of social insecurity? Within the government, structural transformation is going to require higher capacity in monitoring. We already talked about environmental compliance, but also you're going to have labor compliance, antitrust, regulation, anti-corruption. So just basically, within society, social transformation is cultural upheaval. Parting thoughts. The U.S. push to friendshore, plus China's own missteps and its long-term rising wages provide an important moment for India. India has made progress, but still has far to achieve. Policy must reflect the coming social transformation. AZs can be helpful, but they're not sufficient. Along with research on the drivers of manufacturing growth, I think we economists need to attend to its social costs and benefits, particularly with more attention to the role of women, which is missing, I think, in most of the discussion. But I think India cannot succeed without removing the barriers to female full economic participation. Okay, I'll leave it there. There's so many more issues in Devashish's paper. I've really only touched the surface. Thank you.
So as you all saw, that was, as I had promised, we'll wake you up. I'm going to just use my privilege to ask one question to each of you. Keeping to the theme of the session, you've made the case that exports can spur manufacturing, which Mary also agreed with. But could there be a situation where manufacturing could grow in value added from, say, 15 to 17% of GDP where it's today, further based on domestic demand before exports pick up? Could that be a possibility? And a question for Mary while he ponders the response. It seems that you had too much of a Syracuse solidarity, and there was not much disagreement. So let me invite you to think about, while he responds to the first question, where would you really disagree with Professor Mitra? Yeah. And make it a real good one, because I know you have many in your mind. Yeah.
Yeah, so initially there could be growth in labor-intensive manufacturers, from domestic demand, but it's going to be pretty limited in scope. I mean, in the sense that, could go from 15% to 17%, as you said, but there'll be a limit. And of course, if there's competition from abroad, that's going to make it harder unless you resort to protectionism. And once you raise tariffs, it's not easy to bring them down.
I guess I have to use this, huh? Is it on? Okay. So I think, just following up on that, and then I'll move to my big disagreement. I think, we are seeing manufacturers going into India. I think Apple's going into India because it wants to sell a lot of iPhones to Indians. And also, it's a hedge. It's a hedge. If you look at where Trump put the tariffs, there's a huge, and then you make like a chart that has a bubble for the size of the export bundle. There's this huge bundle out there that's not taxed, and it's called the Tim Cook Memorial Bubble, right? He didn't tax the Apple products, even though he taxed things that are similar in other ways. So Tim Cook knows this, right? And so there's a hedge. There's a hedge going on. In the long run, is that enough to absorb the amount of labor that needs to be absorbed? The answer is no. The second thing, and the thing that I'm not really disagreeing with Devashish, but I'm going to bring out yet another point, which is that, basing your export strategy on geopolitics is risky. China and U.S. may decide that, it's not impossible that they're going to cool it, or the U.S. can get mad at India. I mean, there's all kinds of things, right? Or you can export to countries like the U.S. who decide to protect its own market, but you don't really have comparative advantage anywhere. Look at the solar panels are a great case. The U.S. has virtually removed Chinese panels from our market. And we have now a circumvention case where we're going after 4 Asian countries who are using those inputs. This puts India, if this was to happen, right in the middle of this whole geopolitical thing, a place it does not want to be. So, crafting a manufacturing strategy based on GVCs in this environment has opportunities, but also real dangers and challenges.
Yeah, I agree that geopolitics by itself cannot be responsible for, creating this opportunity for India, but it does, in the presence of rising Chinese wages and so on, it can have that little bit of an effect that puts it above the line. But yeah, I agree that you cannot rely totally on geopolitics. It's quite temporary, right? Yeah.
Okay, so we have about 20 minutes. What we could do is 4 blocks of questions. Let's start with this side of the room, and then we move on my left-hand side afterwards. So start with the gentleman in the white. I guess this question is for Mary.
No, your questions are too hard. That's me for Devashish.
You showed a table which showed the incremental labor growth by category, 4 categories, 4 buckets. There was one particular data set that struck me as being somewhat interesting, that Vietnam had seen a large increase at the labor intensive, the extreme left, and also at the extreme right. That's higher tech, however it's described. And they seem to have not quite vacated, but the middle 2 were kind of less emphasized, at least in the outcomes. And I'm just curious what might have been going on. What's the story behind that particular eventual set of numbers that we're looking at as being sort of big growth in the extreme labor intensive and bigger growth in the extreme right? Thank you.
I think there's a pretty easy answer, which is production fragmentation. So all of your communications devices are in that high-tech category. But in fact, there are many labor-intensive activities within that sector, assembly being a big one. Vietnam has also emerged as a place for your power cords. They're even now beginning to make a camera module, which is a big boost up and value added for them, and shows how this process, once it starts, can organically feed itself. But that's basically what you have there. You have kind of a misclassification issue, but that's how UNCTAD classifies these goods.
Thank you.
Gentleman all the way in the back. Oh.
I'm sorry.
Let's collect 3 questions.
Yeah.
Then, yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Can you
Turn it around. One is a geopolitical question. Pakistan is not happy with a strong India, and they are collaborating with China through the Belt and Road and everything. And Pakistan neighbors Iran, Afghanistan, and China and India. So there might be some tendency to go to China because China is going to be being threatened by the Japanese and Korean diplomacy, the Quad and everything. So how do you see that risk? The second one is, in terms of contract enforcement, India ranks about 168th or 165th in the global contract enforcement lineup. So what is being done to change that, especially in the courts? Thank you.
Let's take 2 more.
I can take one. Go on.
Somebody who's a woman, maybe? Just so. Yes, please.
It's the
woman empowered. Speaking of which, sorry. So, I'm curious, why do we still compare India to China? China is an upper middle income country. Are we even competing in the same kinds of industries or product segments? I guess my question is, what are we doing differently from Bangladesh? Like, how come they're doing so much better in textiles? So, and, one of the things that Mary brought up is the labor force participation of women, which is so much higher in Bangladesh and, has similar demographics, similar cultural values. So what can we do to get where Bangladesh is?
Let's take one more.
Can I?
Below 35.
Right here? Can I say it, please? Yeah. So, with
your
respect
license.
to Indian manufacturing sector, I think we've seen the last 2-3 decades or 3-4 decades that pharmaceutical, as a bulk drugs, we were really successful in India. I read somewhere that 30-40% of the drugs consumed in the US is actually manufactured in India. So if you were to spot one, what did we do right there, point one? And if you were to spot one sunrise industry which could be like that going forward, one or two sectors, what would you think have a bright chance?
Yeah, many of these are pretty hard questions I have no answers to. But, I'd leave the Pakistan, China, India IR question to Mary. She was the chair of the IR program in Syracuse for 5 years. So, regarding contract enforcement, there's some work on contract enforcement by a former student of mine, Rashad Hassan, who's at the University of Melbourne, and basically showed how the effects of trade reforms get muted. When it comes to productivity growth, get muted when there are contract enforcement issues. But this is basically it takes very long for cases to be decided in the Indian legal system, and which is basically overburdened. So, of course, there's room for legal reforms and more courts and judges and so on. But other than that, I really don't have like a solution to that problem. But I think the 163rd rank that you mentioned sounds a little old to me. I'll have to check on that. But 2 years ago. So why do we compare India and China? Some of the comparisons I like. For example, if you're saying that, look at China, that is 2.5 times the India's per capita income, and yet India's production techniques are even more capital intensive than China's, it kind of makes a very strong point. So that's useful, right? Because, richer countries should have more capital intensive techniques of production, not less. Well, in the case of India, Bangladesh comparisons, I think a couple of things. We do compare India and Bangladesh, and we find that India does worse than Bangladesh in textiles and apparel. It's of course their firms. I don't think you see that kind of concentration in small firms, textile and apparel firms in Bangladesh like you see in India. I mean, they have very large textile apparel firms. There's a handful of them in India too, but labor laws are an issue. I don't think they have those restrictive labor regulations in Bangladesh. But about the movement of women from one area of Bangladesh to another, it could also be a function of size, land area. It's kind of a very densely populated country in, dense population, high population density within a much smaller area. That could also kind of be making it easier for women to move from one part to another. but this is something that in India we need to study and look at what Bangladesh is doing right to kind of do better in garments and so on. One of the things, of course, is that I think Bangladesh has had a longer period of lower, receiving tariff concessions in the EU and so on because of its per capita income. That has helped Bangladesh quite a bit in the sense that, India didn't qualify for many of those preferences. Regarding pharmaceuticals, why does India do well in pharmaceuticals? India actually also India has a large population, needs pharmaceuticals, and there might be some scale economies there. And once you know how to produce those drugs, it's probably doesn't require a lot of expertise to kind of produce. And so, even with its low-skilled labor, India has been able to do well there. I don't know how much labor laws would matter in the pharmaceuticals industry, and Arvind would be able to kind of tell us more about that.
So the one thing that Mary mentioned last night at dinner, which was that on the India-China comparison, even though it may not make sense to compare them today, it may still be valuable to compare India to, say, China in the 2000s when they were entering the export market. So that may be lessons.
Yeah, I'll add something to that. We still do India-South Korea comparisons, and in fact, in Arvind's book, there is a chapter on that because, in the 50s and 60s, India and South Korea were at the same level, and what made South Korea so much ahead of India is worth comparing, right?
Okay, so 3 more questions. I want to give space to one of my former professors and greatest intellectual influences, Jan Schweiner.
We should have 2 questions by 2 people who are the same age, no?
Yes. 2 people born on the same day. 70 plus.
So I'm not an India specialist, but what struck me, you have lots of ideas here, and so just to sort of add to it from a different perspective, the focus on manufacturing I think is good, but I'm not sure how quickly one can really transform the entire economy. Now, given that there are countries that moved forward in a major way through agricultural development, Canada, Australia, the US increased efficiency agriculture dramatically through government policies, through the extension stations and all that, right, land grant colleges. It doesn't make sense to still sort of focus to some extent on that big sector. And what I also think, what I see in other countries is that, there's this focus on small firms, of which there are many, as you say, right? But in some sense, one wants to focus on the new firms, right, the startups. And some of them could really be very dynamic. A firm that's small for 20 years probably is not going to change too much. But among the very small firms that are just started with good government policies, you could have major dynamic force in the economy, no?
Thank you. So, yeah, building on what Jan said, evidently, where India already has strengths, you are going to build on that, and that the country is doing. So I think it's to be seen in that sort of light. The pharmaceuticals, you're doing well. You'll continue to, information technology industry, you're doing well. You're not going to let go of that. But it's such a large country. And one of the key statistics is that still today, 45% of India's workforce is in agriculture. And that cannot come into startups, that cannot come into the IT industry, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the one that is to be exploited. Now, want to come to Mary's central question on where are the women, right? So indeed, as in other countries, there are women in the labor-intensive industries in India also. In fact, India's largest exporter firm of apparel, which employs 115,000 workers by itself, was founded by a woman 50 years ago. And it also employs a very large number of women. And to build on that very quickly, recently, you also raised the issue, how are you going to do it without bringing women into the workforce? Of course, bringing women into the workforce is an extremely important objective, but I do not think even the percentage is small, but it's a small percentage of a very large number. And even the women that are there, I think, are grossly underemployed. And so there is a lot of scope, in fact, to improve the productivity and employ the women much more effectively. And there is still restrictions which are women-specific, which hinder their entry into the workforce. When Apple is coming in, it's just very recent, within the last 1 month. In Karnataka, it negotiated a labor law reform with the Karnataka government, saying that allow the women to do night shifts. Now, till today, night shifts actually have not been allowed, and it is probably going to be changed through this kind of multinational pressure.
One more last question from that same table.
Ruchir, can I use my microphone privilege to ask a question? Yeah, maybe.
So the last question to be added, and then.
Okay, so my question is for Professor Devashish. Like in India's policy circles, there has been we witnessed a fractured opinion about the performance-linked incentive, the PLI scheme, and many hail it as a success story if you see the exponential growth in some of the sectors like cell phone exports and manufacturing. So, what is your assessment of its efficacy and appropriateness as a strategy of manufacturing-fed growth?
Is that question for him or for Subbu?
Maybe for both, yeah.
Mary, maybe first, and then.
Yeah, I'll just respond very quickly. Of course, Jan, there's, this is structural transformation. So you have to work on agriculture, you have to work on. I'm not sure why agriculture is held back. In China, it was obvious, right? They moved to away from collectivization, and that raised productivity and allowed younger workers say, I'm not needed here, I'm not going to earn anything here. So I don't know what the situation is in India, but I leave that to the Indian scholars. On the women issue, I am not going to let you off the hook that easy. Okay. I think that's too easy an answer, that we need to use the existing women or just drive them harder. I think that that there needs to be a broader entry into the labor force. And that would happen because a lot of these women are working every day, right? They're just working informally, or they're working at home on farms or other things. And so that process will happen. And then how is that accommodated? How is the family supported through that process? I think this is something that would bear some attention by we economists now. But I also see in your answer the role of foreign investment coming in and bringing some Western values. There's been a lot of research on this. And we know, for example, in other places that foreign invested enterprises pay higher wages. They're among the most desirable jobs for younger, more educated people. They have better gender equity. So again, by bringing in more foreign investment and leading the way, hopefully some of those practices spill over to the domestic employer.
Yeah, so let me answer Jan's question about startups. I mean, I already mentioned that, if you look at the people with, proportion of the population with tertiary education, it's pretty low. And so education is a constraint there. And as far as agriculture goes, I mean, I don't think we can really compare India with Canada or Australia. Look at the population density, and these are India is not really a land-abundant country. I mean, relative to population, the land is not really terribly abundant. I mean, Australia just has it's huge landmass and 26 million population. I mean, compared to India of 1,400 million, 1.4 billion, one-third the area. So bringing in more people into agriculture on that small amount of land is, you're running into diminishing returns very easily. Regarding PLIs, it's a good idea. You want to promote people who are producing more productive, but it shouldn't be combined with PMP. That's going to be problematic. I'll just leave it pretty short. Yeah.
We are at time. I would just like to say one thing, because we also see, there is somebody who really wants to say something, so maybe we just give him, yes, please.
One blockbuster question. by focusing only on manufacturing exports, not on services exports, I think the entire discussion is off the rails. From very low levels, services exports are 2/3 of the level of manufacturing exports and will in due course overtake them. So we have a huge comparative advantage in services, much more than in manufacturing. This is driving up the exchange rate. By definition, it's a Dutch disease issue. The success of service exports, other things equal, will appreciate the exchange rate to the point where manufactured exports become uncompetitive. The more our services exports boom, the more it's going to hit manufacturing exports. At the end of it, we can have a larger thing on whether this is a good outcome or bad outcome. At the end of it all, services exports are also labor intensive. But it seems to me that if you don't bring in services, the entire discussion right now actually fails to get at the root of some of the problems.
This is also Jan's question, building on Jan's. So this table up front basically is saying that the theme of the session itself has an existential problem. So maybe you're asking the wrong question. Basically, should we actually go back and skip to the service export? Mary, you had some ideas on that.
No, I would just say that manufacturing are becoming more service intensive. That is the whole message of the latest GVC report that came out of the OECD. So these two things, it's not either or, it's becoming and. So there you need to look at what are the actual services that India is specializing in. If it's call centers, that's not the same thing as business services that support manufacturing development. So I agree with you. We only had an hour and a half. We could do a day, but point well taken.
I'll leave it at that. Yeah.
Okay, so let me just summarize. What I wanted to say is there are also a lot of students here, and we know they're watching from a variety of fields within economics. And what I hope this session has shown is this single question, or whether this question should be a question at all, itself goes into various aspects of economics and economic policy. And there are many fascinating open questions here, and we hope this ignites the interest and crowds in more researchers to this very centrally important question, not just for India, but for the world.
The major topic which we discussed, we have the import tax and we have the export tariffs and so on. When India knows that it has to really have the export-oriented situation, why are we not regulating that and why are we not controlling the tariffs? That's number one. Number two, India itself is suffering because of the imported material. If you see that half of India is buying China's stuff within India because the cost of it is much cheaper. So when we know that the imports are really dominating the domestic products and India in turn is not even importing the technology without the tariffs, isn't it really affecting a double whammy to Indian manufacturing industry?
Maybe we take this at coffee. So, yeah. Well noted, and you have to answer it in coffee break.